Okay, so welcome everyone to, I guess the third day of sessions now, or fourth day of sessions. So very intense educational tracks here. So the focus today is CBRS and private networking strategies. And got a great panel, and I think we'll just go through a few introductions. So my name is John Hoodley. I work at Mavenir. I lead North American Sales Engineering, Product Architecture. Been involved with wireless for far too many years, more years than I'd like to admit. Been through. Then I missed first, 1G, but intimately involved in 2G, 3G, 4G, and now 5G. Been involved in in-building and macro solutions. So I'll move it over to the panel and let Patrick, Mark, and Andreas introduce themselves. Patrick?
Okay, so my name is Patrick Buchman. I'm the Vice President of Sales and Business Development for Blink Networks. We're obviously a 4G, 5G, CBRS product vendor. We manufacture base stations, CBs, etc. Keep it short and sweet.
Mark Foster. I run the wholesale broadband effort at US Cellular, sales and operations. So, as well as our MVNO business and our custom IoT business.
Hey everyone, I'm Andreas. Run the broadband practice at Select Spectrum, facilitates transactions for licensed wireless spectrum.
Okay, so we'll start with questions, and we'll take a break at kind of a midway point and see if the audience has some questions as well. So, the topic CBRS and private networking. And one thing I've noticed is private networking seems to have a different definition, almost dependent on who you talk to. So, let's start this time first with Patrick, and then let you tell us what you think of private networking is.
Okay, so we kind of answered this one for anybody that was in our Monday session as well, which was a similar topic. And I take a slightly contrarian approach to a certain extent. The private network is any network that's not part of the big three. I mean, we could even potentially say US Cellular is a private network to some extent, because they're just a smaller version. People think of wireless networks and they think AT&T, T-Mobile, Verizon. And, they're overseas, Vodafone, Telecom, etc., etc. But to me, the definition of a private network is any network that is run for the purposes of your own business benefit and not something that is part of a larger, traditional mobile operation, for example. What you do and what your use cases are for the private network is limited only by your own imaginations and the capabilities of the technology you have.
We look at private networks as kind of a catch-all term for a range of solutions. So on the sort of maybe a simplistic version of that would be even a private APN VPN setup could be considered a private network. Our larger friends, the tier ones, they tend to think of a private network in terms of CUPS architecture or like network slicing in the 5G world. And then as you go up the model and complexity, then you've got customers that want to support their own core, or even do the core and the full brand build out. And so we really look at the space as, we try to start with a yes and identify customer needs and help guide them to the right solution for themselves.
I think Mark and Patrick did a really good job of hitting it. I think to elaborate a little bit, a private network can be tailored to suit whatever applications or use cases that you're looking to support, right? And each entity is different, and each entity has a different use case or application. And I think, in our experience as it relates to what we're hearing that our customers want to get out of private networks is they want to manage and they want to control this network on their own. And quite frankly, they don't want to compete, as Patrick put it, with the top 3 with millions of consumers that are also on that network, right, tugging away at that capacity. They want to make sure that they have that dedicated and exclusive use to support those mission critical, if you will, applications or whatever application may be.
Okay, so I really like those definitions. I think the broader the view, the better, because I think we're finding that it's not just like an enterprise type of application. So you've started to answer this already, but where are you seeing the biggest use cases, and what's the real starting point for private networks? What types of industries, what types of applications, and you know, you kind of started, Andreas, you kind of finished off a bit with that, but would you like to elaborate a bit more where you see the biggest uptake right initially anyway?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, at least from our perspective, the biggest uptick and where the greatest demand is with utilities and critical infrastructure entities, looking for this privatized network, whether 4G LTE or 5G, to again support those applications and those use cases, and furthermore, maybe consolidate some of their legacy networks and be able to modernize, if you will, the way that their networks work, as well as support all of the various applications and use cases that they're looking to support. So I think utilities, in addition to that, maybe education, especially as it relates to what's been going on in the world the past few years. The education vertical is showing a significant interest in privatized networks to support, you know, the connectivity for the faculty, the students, and the constituents, if you will, of the general community.
So these are pretty big private networks. So Mark, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll piggyback that. So there's been sort of a lot of hype around private networks, and so from US Cellular's perspective, we're looking at what are the big pure play opportunities. Utilities are certainly probably at the top of the chain there. Just because it's such an obvious business case, they've been supporting all these proprietary ISM networks for years and years. It's a nightmare to administer. Now they can go to a single LTE-based solution and reduce costs, gain control, prevent lock-in with various partners. And so that's really where our focus has been, is that utility space. Next up for us is, Industry 4.0, education, and some of the other use cases.
So what we're seeing is really kind of a mix of customers that are seeing that. First and foremost, one of the big ones we see from a private network perspective are the people in this room. Fixed wireless access is probably one of the biggest uses, and it's a private network. And okay, we can talk about LTE and 5G, for example, is certainly one element of that. But there's also the elements of any kind of network that you want to offer is technically a private network, and it's certainly a big use case for that. However, once you want to start looking into how do you expand that and grow your revenues, for example, grow your ARPU and so on and so forth from an operator perspective, that's when you look at saying, okay, do I want to participate in a decentralized wireless model, for example, with players like Poland and others, or do we want to do something such as offering mobile services, for example, those types of things where you could expand your existing FWA network and then migrate or move into things like offering mobile services. Other areas we see, to agree with with Mark and Andreas, we see a lot of activity in the education space that's been obviously very popular for the last 2 years. Some have stepped back from that, but we actually see a lot that have taken government money and said, hey, we've found that rather than going to one of the big 3 players and the cost per student to connect them during the pandemic was measured in tens of dollars per month, despite any federal and statewide subsidies, and running their own private network got them to the point where they were sub $10, for example. So it was much more cost effective for them to operate their own network versus actually getting a subsidized handout and dealing with one of the big 3 players.
Okay, so you hit on something there that private networks sound like people can run their own, but kind of for this audience and for kind of wireless service providers, kind of wondering what your thoughts are in terms of what roles can they play in private networks? What roles can the 2 combine together? The WISP plus the wireless service providers. How can they kind of make a business out of this and get some revenue? So I'll start with yourself, Mark.
It seemed like a multi-part question there.
Well, it's really about how does a WISP or how does a service provider bring a private network or what? If it's all private, is it just the enterprise or just the entity that kind of runs it, or do they need partners?
Yeah, no, it's definitely there's opportunities to partner. I mean, an obvious one would be how do you handle for a mobility use case by yourself, right? So a partner with a larger CSP would allow you to bring a mobility element to a client. The models kind of an interesting model. So it's from our perspective, it's one that's focused more along the lines of delivering, you know, how do we fill coverage gaps for folks? How do we, you know, provide connectivity in the interim of them building out their own brand, let's say. But as you move up the stack into the larger opportunities, we're really talking about managed services. You know, maybe they want to own their core and their brand, but they might not want to manage it. They might not want to run it, and that's a really significant area of revenue. We think that's where the business is going. Access to ecosystem and relationships for these clients. Access to engineering talent. You know, hiring network engineers isn't a fun proposition these days. Those guys are hard to come by. So.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. People need help in doing this. Right? So, Patrick, your thoughts?
So this is an interesting one that we've started having conversations with some of our customers that are, you know, the type of wireless service providers that are in this room, the local WISPs. And one of the things that they are looking to do, typically that business model, as you guys in this room all well know, has been providing connectivity to rural customers spread throughout America. But that had a limited market and, you know, became heavy competition, even risking overbuilds and so on and so forth. What we've seen and what we've tried to help a lot of our WISPs do is to partner with them to build private wireless networks that enable them. They know their local school boards, they know their local EMS, you know, fire, police, emergency departments, etc. They can go in and actually talk to some of them. And we've had a lot of conversations this week with various WISPs about doing just that. They want to go talk to the local school board, and they know the local school board, and their kids have gone to school there or are still going to school there, for example. And they go in and say, hey, we want to offer a solution for you guys to be able to connect your students locally, remotely, etc. You know, make it part of a larger, you know, county-wide school network or a statewide school network, for example. And they start to participate in that. So the WISP actually expands into that private wireless network offering and may create a network that is, you know, sliced off of their existing one, or maybe a completely independent network, but it's managed and operated by the WISP, for example, on behalf of that enterprise, that public services sector, or that enterprise, that education market. So we're starting to see a lot of that happen in this space as well. And I think that's an area that, you know, as WISPs, you can look at doing that and say, here's another chance for me to grow my business. And you know, the states and school boards are good at paying revenue, and you don't have to go after them every 30 days because they didn't pay their bill, for example, and roll a truck that, you know, disconnects them. So.
Andreas, what do you think there?
Yeah, I mean, I think Patrick and Mark did a really good job there, and I think they hit the nail on the head in terms of we're talking about managed services here. Is exactly what we're talking about, and just to come at it from a different perspective. I mean, you guys in this room, you have the infrastructure already. You have the whether wireless assets or hardware, whatever it may be, set up in your respective geography, and you have the expertise, right? You guys know how to deploy this stuff, you know how to deploy LTE or whatever it may be. And it's a really great opportunity to build out a non-competing entity, right? This is an entity that is not going to compete with your business. They're not trying to provide fixed wireless services. They're trying to support their own respective applications and use cases. So I think it's a really good opportunity to effectively leverage the resources that you already have in place.
All right. Yeah, so I thought that was a super important question. What's in it for the WISP in the wireless service provider? So let's just switch gears a little and get a little more techy. So what spectrum should we be using? Where should that go? Andreas, you're flex spectrum. So
lead off here, huh? All right, beautiful. I like the lead off or cleanup, but nowhere in between. So really, it's a really great question, and I don't think that there's one answer to it. I think it's solely dependent on the applications and use cases that you know customers looking to support, right? That maybe it's something a little bit lower data intensive. Maybe you don't need broadband spectrum, right? Maybe it's a utility trying to support the remote monitoring of their metering or something like that. So I think the first question is, what kind of applications are you trying to support? And then once you understand that, you can address it with the spectrum that would be the most capable or appropriate to do so.
Okay. Yeah.
I think from our viewpoint, one of the big things that has really happened over the last, you know, 4 or 5 years, and this is why we're starting to see the rise of private wireless networks, you know, with greater use cases for them, has been that CBRS has come along and really democratized the private LTE and private 5G market to a large extent. You go back 10 years or even 5 years, it was just not possible. You had to, if you wanted a private wireless network, you called up one of the big three, and they would carve up VPN for you and say, okay, well, here you go, here's your private network. And then we're going to turn around and sell you a bunch of phones, and here's your price per device per month, and here's your number, gig of transfer and number of minutes of phone calls. And that was a private wireless network 5 years or, exactly 5 years or 10 years ago, that was exactly what you got. Now, you effectively have the ability to cut the operators, the big three operators out of it and say, we're going to do this yourself. And that spectrum is readily available and cheap. And yes, Andreas is absolutely right. The use case is the critical part, because if you don't need huge amounts of spectrum, there may be more cost-effective ways to do it with different uses of, different cases of spectrum. If, it's an LMR system or something else, there may be other things that you need to do in terms of different choices of spectrum. But CBRS has certainly democratized that private wireless market, and we are starting to see that trend hit in other countries as well. So this is something that we have started in the US and we've blazed the trail. But moving forward, Ofcom in the UK has opened up 100 megahertz of 3.5 gig spectrum. Germany, the Netherlands, Czech Republic, now Sweden. So we're actually just launching, a new network with a customer in Sweden. With our partners down there, we just had a long conversation with them yesterday. And there are some of those things that are happening now along the way. But certainly that low cost, reliable, semi or lightly licensed spectrum in 3.5 that has strong characteristics has really opened this up to being able to do your own network and the capabilities that come along with it.
And maybe I could jump in just for one more second. I'm sure Patrick and Mark will agree. I mean, the transition to the CBRS band from the NN band, if everybody remembers that, 3650 to 3700, I mean, it's really generated an opportunity pretty much for the first time, as Patrick alluded to, for WISPs in particular to obtain access to dedicated use exclusive channels, right, in comparison to some of the unlicensed bands and things like that. There really hasn't been another band that has been widely available. For not only the WISPs, but the other verticals that we're speaking about as well, in terms of getting some dedicated use capacity to support their applications.
Okay. Any thoughts? Do I have to have a PAL, or can I really live with just GAA for a lot of these private networking applications, GAA bands? And are there any spectrum concerns or any thoughts or mitigation strategies?
I can pick it up. You start off if you guys want. I mean, I look at the PALs like the foundation to the house. Does anyone in the room, does anyone have a house without a foundation? Probably not. You're not just going to build a house without a foundation. And I think the importance of a PAL today, GAA is relatively available, but I think you mitigate any kind of, you future-proof your network by obtaining a PAL, right? In terms of other large carriers still have yet to light up their PAL channels that they want to launch in 105. They're respective of the cable companies in their respective areas of the country. So what's going to happen when they light up those PALs is it's going to take the capacity from GAA and reallocate it to the PAL tier, therefore no longer being able to use in the lightly licensed tier. So I think PAL future-proofs your network, especially if you have like a mission-critical use case or something like that. Some of the folks in the utilities, like we spoke about, they're probably not going to operate in GAA because they can't count on that for, in perpetuity, if you will. If they obtain a PAL either by lease or sale, they can call on that 10 megahertz, notwithstanding the incumbent, if they're in one of those areas, to support their application. So I think a PAL is important. But it may not be necessary at this point in time, right? You guys may be in a market where you have all 150 megahertz of GAA. I think it's just mitigating it and future-proofing the network by obtaining the PAL today.
So I'll jump in on that one. I think, and I agree, I think PALs are important, but I will temper that a little by saying the use case is really what matters. If you're doing indoor deployments, for example, PALs don't really have a big impact. You're not really, if you're doing a lot of indoor private wireless type solutions, in buildings, schools, manufacturing, etc., some of those things, A, you're probably not going to be subject to DPA events, and B, you're probably not going to really be subject to, PAL intrusion from the incumbents or anything like that, for example, or even the PAL license holders. So I think in an in-building, example, CBRS, with GAA works perfectly fine. I also think it really depends upon what you're doing and where you're at from an external basis. If you're on the West Coast or coastal, yeah, it's a lot more critical from a PAL PAL licensing perspective as far as some of that goes. I think if you're, you know, in the middle of nowhere and it's not a heavily populated area, you can probably build a network very successfully from a GAA perspective. So I really think it depends upon the use case.
Okay. Anyone else want to add on that? All right. So operational models and setting these systems up. Just wanted to kind of touch base on, you know, is this a decentralized model? Is it something that's centralized in terms of core functions, or how should people think about it, and what are the different use cases? And I think we're having a theme about use cases here. And so I'll start with you, Patrick, and we'll change to that.
So I think this is another area where over the last 5 years things have really changed.
Yeah.
You know, much like the launch of CBRS, if you were to go back, you know, 5 years or 10 years and say, hey, I want to set up a 3G, 4G network, for example, go back 5 years. I wanted to set up an LTE network where it was, you know, equipment was readily available, but again, it came from one of the big 3 or 4 telco equipment manufacturers, your Ericsson, Samsung, Nokia's, Huawei's, etc. And, you know, and having formerly worked for those types of companies, the price tags came with 7 or you know, 8-figure type price tags, and they were not the sort of thing that you get as an individual. You know, the big 3 carriers, the wireless network is their business. If you're, whether you're a small manufacturing plant or a farm or a school, whatever else, you're not going to spend, you know, $5, 10, 25, $50 million to build a private wireless network, you know, on your campus, because it's A, not your core business, and B, it's just an enabler for you to do your actual core business. So one of the things that really changed over the last 5 years was the proliferation of lower cost LTE providers from a hardware perspective. That certainly helped. So CBRS plus lower cost hardware solutions. The third element was the complexity, and Mark hinted at this earlier, you know, trying to find resources that understand what an evolved packet core was, and, you know, okay, what's an S1U interface, and what's an S1C interface, and, you know, why do I need a GTP tunnel? Why do I need a packet core? What do I need SIM cards for? All of these things were things that were very complicated. And along the lines of this, you know, move towards private wireless has been a move towards the simplification of this. You know, whether it's doing a decentralized wireless model, for example, and a lot of that complexity is taken, you know, away or moved, you know, into a core that is managed by another entity that basically says, hey, we'll even incentivize you to do something like this. Or if it's just simply that there's a simple deployment model that says, hey, we've got a low-cost gateway that sits at the tower, connects your base stations to it, and all of your management's done completely in the cloud. It's completely user interface, you know, web UI, you know, UI type friendly, and very easy, you know, simple to set up and configure. And oh, by the way, hey, the boxes are, for example, fully integrated. Everything's built in. You know, it's plug 2 cables in, and all of a sudden you're up and running. I think that has had a big impact on it, as well as the ability to deploy equipment that is very simple and straightforward to deploy, and to literally try and make, you know, LTE and 5G as simple to deploy as Wi-Fi has been for the last 10 years.
Okay, Mark, what are your thoughts about different operational models?
Yeah, we keep saying use cases, but if we're talking about low complexity deployments, you know, that's sort of a BAU process for us to stand up clients. We have, you know, platforms for them to step onto. We have teams that build, you know, the tunneling needs and so forth. For the larger customers, it's really about making introductions for them to the larger ecosystem, so they can source the various components and so forth. And then from our perspective, we stand up models like sponsor roaming to support their connectivity needs, so they can come in, truly build their network, you know, in partnership with vendors, and then, you know, we connect to them sort of like a peer-to-peer model, where just like we would connect with one of our roaming partners, like Verizon or AT&T. So we connect up to the IPX, the inter-carrier exchange with those guys, and let them access connectivity as they need to. So.
Okay, great. Andreas?
I think Mark and Patrick covered that really well.
I think so. Okay, so we've got a few more questions here, but I thought, you know, this might be a good break point for any questions from the audience.